Hello, everyone. Welcome. We are going to get started in about 30 seconds, but we're so excited that you're here. Good morning and welcome. My name is Callie Wells. I am the Executive Director of the North Carolina Council on Developmental Disabilities. Our work at the Council on Developmental Disabilities is to advocate and educate for systems change and improvements for people with intellectual and developmental disabilities across our great state of North Carolina. And I am so excited that you're here today. We have a fantastic presentation, and I am very, very excited to introduce our speakers in just a minute. But first, I want to welcome Jenny Fogg and thank Jenny, because Jenny is with Disability Rights North Carolina, and the North Carolina Council on Developmental Disabilities and Disability Rights North Carolina have joined together to sponsor today's event. So welcome, Jenny.
Thank you so much, Callie. Disability Rights North Carolina is pleased and honored to be able to be part of this presentation today and to work alongside with the council on this really important subject matter for all of our work. Disability Rights North Carolina is the state's protection and advocacy organization for people with disabilities in North Carolina statewide. I am the supervising attorney of the special education team. And our primary work focuses on keeping students with disabilities in school. Most of the time that means returning them to school after they have been excluded for reasons related to their disabilities. And we are very eagerly anticipating the information that our presenters will give us today because we think it will be instrumental in our work. Thank you.
Thank you. And we're so honored to have you co-sponsoring this and working with us on all of the issues that impact our disability community, but particularly education. As Garry and Arianne know, I spent a lot of my career, but particularly the last 2 years that I was in Georgia from the end of 2017 through the beginning of 2020, working on keeping kids in school and out of the criminal justice system. And there were two incredible champions of that work. I first got to meet Dr. Garry McGiboney, who was the Deputy Superintendent of the Georgia Department of Education, right when I started at a new job, Georgia Appleseed. And Georgia Appleseed's work was really to keep kids in school and out of the criminal justice system. And it had already done sort of extraordinary work across Georgia. But really what it was doing was trying to magnify and megaphone Garry McGiboney and what he was doing around positive behavioral supports for children, and really sort of reorienting our education system, all of our systems that support children, from one where we sort of have a 1800s idea of discipline and behavior, and that you punish children and you somehow think that that's going to educate them to be better behaved, and instead really look at how do we really sort of encourage positive supports. And Garry, you were able to get schools across the state and school systems across the state and school superintendents across the state to really take on PBIS, so that more than 50% of schools were doing this, so that the number of kids who were being kicked out of school and sent to juvenile justice dropped by huge percentages through the work that you did. And then you were able to get school-based behavioral health in schools, and so that more than 20% of schools in Georgia now have a robust school-based behavioral health. So I went to talk to you right when I started at Georgia Appleseed to hear from you, since you were such a part of the work there as I became executive director. And all you did was talk about Arianne Weldon, who is our other speaker today, and the extraordinary work that Arianne was doing and how she had opened your eyes about speech and language and that correlation with behavior. So I then, of course, went and met with Arianne, and I can remember the coffee shop we met at in Atlanta, and you really opened my eyes to speech and language, but you also showed me what a correlation there was with children's literacy and with a number of other of those markers that policymakers and parents really care deeply about for children. And so I'm so honored. I said earlier that it feels like a little bit of a wedding where you have friends from one group and friends from another group come together. And so to have some of my real heroes in Georgia, where I lived and worked and did advocacy on behalf of people with disabilities from 2000 to 2020, to now be in North Carolina and to have you speaking in front of, right now we've got 81 folks across North Carolina, really is a wonderful honor. So I will now turn it over to Arianne and Garry, and welcome to North Carolina.
Hello, everyone, and thank you, Callie. It's a pleasure to speak with everyone today, and thank you, Callie, for inviting us. It's good to see you, Callie. We miss you in Georgia.
I miss y'all.
In the time we have together today, we're going to talk about the importance of language, a topic that needs to be addressed with those who work with teens and children, as well as young adults. We've shared this presentation with teachers and counselors and speech and language pathologists and school nurses and school administrators and juvenile court judges and court system employees, DFACS caseworkers, colleges, foster parents, and other people. And why is that important? Because this work and the awareness is for everyone who work with children and teens and young adults, and not just educators. And that's important because the point is there's something for all of us to know and to do. So before we get into the details about language, it's important to put this discussion into context. And that context is how systems work, because what we'll discuss today is a new concept. And let me ask you a question. Have you ever been frustrated with a system? And I'm sure you have, because you've been experiencing how difficult it is to navigate a system and how hard it is to change a system. And that's why this quote resonates today, because if we cannot change a system, maybe it's up to us to create a new system that makes this current system obsolete. But, well, how do we do that? Let's illustrate that by the next slide. Most of us live in the remedy system. Why? Because we're extremely busy with a long list of things to do. So let's look at this slide for a moment, because the distinction between a remedy and a solution is important in today's presentation. So what happens if we are remedy focused? Well, this means we're interested in the problem, of course, but we're responding to the presenting problem instead of looking for the basic problem, because we are task-driven instead of purpose-driven. Do you remember the best-selling book a few years ago titled The Purpose-Driven Life? You know, that book that was on the bestseller list for years, the one that everybody claims they read. Yeah, that one. If you read the book, do you remember the first sentence in the book? The first sentence in The Purpose-Driven Life, really a book that everyone needs to read, is this: it's not about you. And I'm sorry I have to say this, but when we are remedy focused, it's about us, even if our intentions are good and noble, because in the remedy system, we chase problems and search for remedies so that we can move on to something else. But let me ask you this: what happens when we remain in the remedy system, when we address just the presenting problem instead of looking for the basic problem? Look at the next slide. That's right. You probably knew the answer before we showed it, right? The problems come back to you time and time again if we focus only on remedies. And this is true in our professional lives, and it's also true in our personal lives. The problem comes back because the basic problem has not been addressed. And really, two things happen when we chase problems in the remedy system. One, you never catch the problem. And number two, the chase wears you down physically and emotionally. It burns you out. Now, I know what some of you are probably thinking, well, Gary, if the remedy system is so bad, why do we stay in the remedy system? And that's a good question. And it's because sometimes it gets the problem out of our way, so we think it works. It gets us through our day. But guess what will keep coming back to you? Right, the same problem. So today we're going to focus on a basic problem that too often is part of the remedy system. And we will illustrate how seeking the basic problem can create a new system, a system based on solutions that can change the lives of children and teens and even young adults that you interact with and make you feel hopefully more confident when working with them. We're going to talk about a basic problem, but keep in mind that the basic problem we're not referring to as what's wrong with the child. Instead, it may be that we have not considered language in any context, which is focusing on the importance of language and how we make opportunities to better engage children and teens in learning and in socialization. So with language, we're not, and we need to emphasize this, with language, we're not talking about a deficit model. Instead, we're talking about a language as a well-being indicator. The difference is important because a well-being indicator in this new system means we can do much more than we're doing now because we are missing some real opportunities. And watch this, we could replace the idea of deficits with engagement at all levels. A measure of health is the ability and capacity and opportunity to engage with others, to engage in learning, to engage in problem solving, to engage with our surroundings. So the purpose of commitment is to find those opportunities to engage. You see a significant number of children and teens, the research shows, cannot engage. So they cannot express or channel their frustrations or express their needs and understand what's going on around them because they do not have the necessary language. So some of them act out or withdraw as a form of communications. In other words, when children don't have language, their behavior becomes their language. And that statement represents a different perspective that should move us to look for solutions. So, what is a common view of the existing system?
Does this look familiar to anyone? Maybe a little old school, but it might be familiar. So really the point about this slide is this file folder, it's stuffed full. And really a point of view that can be often too common is that's the story on the kid right there. So a 17-year-old boy, high school dropout, everything we need to know is in this file. But really, is this a file folder full of remedies? Possibly. And really, so the point here is the numbers and files can't talk back, but what if they could? What if the numbers and files could talk and tell us a story? What if they told us we got the story wrong and that our remedy was not a solution? We're about solutions. So rather than staying here, the question is, how do we move from remedies to solutions? So what we offer is to look at the system from an epidemiological perspective. And so there are a couple of basic things about epidemiology that I want all of you to think about and walk away with. And please note these because there'll be a little bit of a pop quiz in the middle of the presentation. But you're all really going to be sort of junior epidemiologists if you're not already. And there's just a couple of basic things to note. One thing we know for diseases that they don't occur by chance. There are always factors that influence them to occur. We may not know what they are, but we know those factors exist. And the key there is that those factors are not random. When we find patterns of those patterns provide clues to inform solutions. And the truth is, the same is true with behavior problems, if you want to use that as one example. Behavior problems are the same thing. They don't occur by chance. There are always factors that influence behavior problems to occur. They're not random. And patterns of factors provide clues to inform solutions. So that's really key. And you're going to hear about how this starts to be applied in different contexts for today's presentation. And maybe a simple way of describing this is a wonderful quote. There's a crack in everything. That's how the light gets in. So some basics. The ability to communicate is fundamental to the social, emotional, and academic success of children and teens. Frequent positive social interactions are the fuel for brain development and the development of language. So frequent positive social interactions are so key to being human. And language is the primary vehicle for frequent and positive social connections with caregivers, educators, and peers, and non-negotiable for education attainment, mental and physical health and well-being, and positive quality of life. Before we go any further, something that came up early on when we started to do this presentation and kept looking more and more and more, falling into the rabbit hole of the lit review, there's a really important distinction, and it's something that sometimes goes unnoticed. It's a difference between speech and language. So speech is about producing sounds accurately. It's physically producing speech. So a couple of basic examples here: articulation and fluency. One thing to note about this is a presenting factor. It's not hidden, right? So we don't need to really look far to notice that there may be a speech issue, right? So when you think back to the remedy versus solution, we may not really look at the thing that is not quite as overt. And this is something that is very clear. Language actually deals with meaning and connection with others. And three basic elements of language: expressive language, sharing thoughts and feelings using verbal and nonverbal communication; receptive language, understanding the intents of others. Think about that, understanding the intent of others; and pragmatic language, which sometimes doesn't get included in the conversation. That's the social use of verbal and nonverbal communication. So overall prevalence, I like to call this one big lump overall. When you begin to disaggregate it by population, you see a lot of differences, and you're going to see that today. But at least 12% of children entering school have language difficulties that hinder their social development and educational progress. Now, remember the patterns that I mentioned earlier? We know from research that these are issues that significantly predict problems with behavioral, mental health, and academic outcomes if left unaddressed, if unnoticed, and so forth. And you'll hear more. So why does this matter?
Well, that's a good question. So look at this quote, and it's powerfully true. If all my possessions were taken from me with one exception, I would choose to keep the power of communication, for by it I would soon regain all the rest. It's important to understand that the effective use of language is linked to increased student engagement and decreased aggressive behavior. Research also shows that children and teens who have language difficulties are much more likely to experience peer rejection, are more likely to be bullied, and really are subject to feelings of anger, and sometimes overwhelming anger that they may turn toward themselves or toward others. In fact, anger may be the symptom, the presenting problem that indicates language difficulties exist, which really could be the basic problem. But too often we respond to the anger, the problem that's in front of us, which of course we cannot ignore, but the consequences and our reaction to the behavior may take us down the wrong path with a child or teen, which means we may be missing an opportunity to find a solution so we can work more effectively with that child or teenager and head off a negative trajectory of his or her life. And we need to remember this, language difficulties are the most frequent developmental issue among children and teens, according to a growing body of research, yet language development is seldom considered when we respond to the behavior and other problems of children and teens. So what are some early clues and impacts of language development?
So language development starts very early. It actually starts prenatally. And we know that frequent social interactions between a baby and their caregiver are the fuel for the development of language. Language development has predictable sequences. So it's important to note those predictable sequences. Again, when we can predict something that's important, it's helpful. By age 2, most children will use single words and brief phrases to communicate for many reasons, including requests for actions. Daddy up would be a common one, and requests for comfort, mommy hug. By kindergarten, they will demonstrate greater self-regulation and academic skills and fewer externalizing and internalizing problem behaviors. Now, again, when we say that most children, and we're talking about this, we know that if a child isn't able to, the more we enrich the environment, enrich our capacity to engage children in the development of those indicators, the more likely we're going to see these this continued healthy development in kindergarten. So it's a powerful indicator for all children, again, spoken, verbal, nonverbal, and so forth. And research demonstrates that language development is the most important predictor of literacy and math outcomes in the early grades. By the end of elementary school, for example, only 15% of students with language difficulties achieve the expected levels in reading, compared to 61% of their peers without language difficulties. This continues into adulthood. Children with language difficulties at age 5 from longitudinal studies, 4 times more likely to have reading problems in adolescence and adulthood, 3 times as likely to be diagnosed with a mental health disorder, and twice as likely to be unemployed. So it's a critical quality of life indicator. But what do language difficulties look like?
Let's take a closer look at this. Let's consider what language difficulties look like so that everyone is aware more of what we're talking about. Earlier, Arianne talked about expressive, receptive, and pragmatic language, but let's go a little bit deeper into those areas. Regarding expressive language difficulties, this includes children and teens who have a limited vocabulary compared to their peers, and you can see, as we noted earlier, why they would more likely experience peer rejection and become very frustrated, because they leave out words when talking, they use tenses incorrectly, and even struggle oftentimes to put words together correctly. So they use choppy sentences or incomplete sentences, which of course hampers their social interactions. And even their simple conversations can be negatively impacted. Sometimes a child or teenager like this will talk in whispers or say, "I don't know," a lot of times, while others will talk very loud. But what you'll often notice with the loud students is that they frequently say the same thing over and over again to cover or hide their limited ability to communicate. Regarding receptive language difficulties, this is when children and teens struggle to understand what's being communicated to them and therefore have problems following instructions or following directions. They have problems understanding what's being said to other students in a class, and even what's expected of them when teachers give instructions to the class. When you're talking to them, they may look at you with a blank expression, which really in itself can be misinterpreted as them having an attitude, or you think they're not paying attention. If we say something, for example, to our own child or our grandchild, or even a child we're working with, and they just stare back at us without saying a word, think about it. What's our typical reaction? Sometimes it goes like this: "Are you listening to me?" And typically we say that with a little more gusto, like, "Are you listening to me?" Children and teens with receptive language, it's important to remember, if they have those receptive language issues, they may also have problems organizing their thoughts and sometimes act out or withdraw when the social environment just becomes too difficult for them to understand. It's just too confusing and overwhelming to them. It's like, have you ever been in a situation where there's so much going on around you, there's so much noise, there's so much movement, that you just want to shout out, "Everybody stop, everybody be still, everybody be quiet"? Well, that's how children and teens with receptive language difficulties feel really almost all the time. So imagine their frustration. When children and teens have issues with pragmatic language, they have a limited ability to read and understand social situations, decipher social cues, or even understand body language or conform to unspoken rules of social engagement. In other words, it really impacts their social interactions. They have difficulty answering questions and initiating and even maintaining conversations. They may make inappropriate and off-topic comments that results in some strange looks from their peers, which can create some conflicts. And they also have narrative difficulties, and these are all increased during times when the student or child is dealing with a lot of stress, or if they're in a very unfamiliar or complicated social situation. So by now, with these descriptions of receptive and expressive and pragmatic language, you're probably thinking now about some children or some teenager that you're working with now that fits some or all of these descriptions. And as we mentioned earlier, the presence of behavior problems and social problems and our learning problems can distract us from considering the existence of language difficulties. And when this happens, we assign cause to the behavior and react to that instead of trying to determine the basic problem of the behavior. In other words, we characterize the behavior, and that's typical. We all do that. We're all prone to characterize other people's behavior. In fact, we think we're pretty good at characterizing behavior. We think we're accurate, but most of the time, or many times, we're not. And we characterize the behavior of others, including children, in such a way that we need to explain it in a little more detail. Because how we characterize behavior has more to do with attribution than anything else. And if I ask you, have you ever heard of attribution? Most of you would probably shake your head no. And some of you maybe have taken a graduate psychology class, and you may remember that one paragraph about attribution theory, but that's probably about it. In fact, I've often told the story. I once asked an audience of over 1,500 people to raise their hands if they had heard of attribution, and only one hand went up. And that's only because he misunderstood the question. It really amazes me that we don't talk more about attribution, because attribution impacts all of us every day of our lives, because it drives many of our decisions, if not most of our decisions. In fact, attribution is this. Now listen carefully. This is attribution. Our response to someone's behavior has more to do with why we think they did it than what they actually did. Now, I know many of you are probably looking at the screen right now with a quizzical look, or maybe saying to yourself or someone near you, what did he just say? So let me repeat it. This is attribution. Our response to someone's behavior has more to do with why we think they did it than what they actually did. That's why we are so inconsistent with things like discipline. We're even inconsistent with how we handle discipline of our own children, because we're responding to our attribution of why we think they did what they did, more so than what they actually did. But then here's the big question. Here's the big question. What happens when we attribute the wrong cause to the behavior? And it's an important question. What happens when we make this error? This is what research has found to be the fundamental attribution error, which is very important. After we decide on a cause for the behavior, we then characterize behavior. And here's where it can get seriously flawed. What if we pick the wrong cause and mischaracterize the behavior? So we're asking everyone to consider doing this. Let's shift from characterizing behavior to describing behavior. We have actually found that many people have difficulty describing behavior because they're so used to and so quick to characterize behavior. I trained many administrators in the school system I worked in many, many years ago on how to describe behavior. And it was enlightening to me to find out how difficult it was for people to actually describe behavior, because we're just so used to characterizing it. So, ladies and gentlemen, let's be honest. When we attribute the behavior of children and teens to laziness, do we give them extra help? Not likely. Why? Because we have characterized the behavior as laziness. We can consider this. Does the child or teenager have the language to understand or even request help? Another example, when we attribute the behavior of children and teens to a lack of concern or interest, do we offer more information or try to explain more? Not likely. But what we can do is make sure they receive an explanation using words they understand. And here's the big one. When we attribute the behavior of children and teens to an attitude, are we interested in giving them a chance to tell their side of the story? No, not likely. What we can do is find out if they have the language to express their thoughts and feelings. And too often, ladies and gentlemen, when we think children and teens are lazy or don't care and or have an attitude, we're done with them. We're finished with them. We kind of write them off. But what if we're wrong? What if we are wrong? We'll give you an example of what can happen when we are wrong in just a minute. In the school setting, for example, when many times that fundamental attribution error may lead to consequences such as out-of-school suspension, we need to take a look at that. And speaking of suspensions, let's look at some data. And this is using Georgia data as an example. Now, Arianne told you earlier that you would have a quiz or test as an epidemiologist in training. Well, here's the test. This graph shows the number of out-of-school suspensions for grades K through 12th grade in Georgia. And here's the test. What do you see in this graph? What do you see on this slide? What do you see in this data? Now remember, Remember, Arianne earlier trained you to be an epidemiologist, so don't look at the data in the way that you normally do. Remember what she said about patterns and clues. And also remember, you're moving from the remedy system to the solution system, and now you are aware of attribution. So having given you all those clues, what do you see?
Dr. McGiboney, we have one brave soul in the chat who ventured a guess, who says that suspensions peak in 9th grade. A second comment coming in says an overwhelming number of suspensions in 9th grade.
Very good observations. And I'll, in the interest of time, I'll tell you what we hear from most people when we do the presentation is exactly that. They point to the high number of suspensions of the 9th grade. So, you know, they want to focus on addressing the problem, and I certainly understand that. And that's what we do often, because that's the data that, you know, just jumps off the graph at you and you think, gosh, we've got to do something about the 9th grade. But consider this. Is it possible that we're looking at the data in the same way as we always have? In other words, we're looking at the presenting problem. Now, I'll tell you a little background on this. At the Georgia Department of Education, every year we looked at discipline data, and I grew kind of tired of looking at data the same way. So I thought, what professional looks at data? And then it occurred to me that epidemiologists look at data all the time. So I told my staff at that time, let's see what an epidemiologist would say about this data. And we happen to have an epidemiologist close by the name of Arianne Weldon. And so I pulled in Arianne, and when we showed this data to our epidemiologist, Arianne, what do you think she said? Before answering the question, she first of all asked me a question. She said, Gary, what's the purpose of data? Now, I thought it was a trick question, so I mumbled some reply. And she said, always remember, first of all, the purpose of data is to generate more questions. At least 2 or 3 more questions. If the data doesn't generate more questions, then you're not looking at the data effectively. So when our friendly epidemiologist, Arianne, looked at this data slide, I expected her to talk about the 9th grade. Do you know what she said instead? She said, Gary, why are you suspending so many little kids? You see, typically our eye goes straight to the 9th grade, the apex of the data, right? And that takes us down the remedy road, or it could take us down the remedy road. Usually it does take us down the remedy road. So where do you think the problems issues began? They didn't begin in the 9th grade, of course not. But our friendly epidemiologist wasn't finished. Then Arianne said, well, what happens later to these young students that are suspended in kindergarten to the 3rd grade? Do they continue to have problems? And we didn't know because we never considered that question before. Why? Because we were focusing, as we have in the past, on worrying about the 9th grade. So to answer that question of what happens to the young students who were suspended during the K through 3rd grades, we asked an independent agency outside of the DOE to research that question. And look at this, they followed 131,000 students. Yes, 131,000 students. And guess what they found? Right, the students suspended in kindergarten to 3rd grade continue to be suspended in other grades and continue to be behind academically. Why? Perhaps because schools were looking at the presenting problem and not really considering the basic problem. And their problems extended into the 9th grade in ELA and algebra, and typically these children have a lower graduation rate also. But Arianne, our epidemiologist, wasn't finished. You know, epidemiologists, I found out, can be a persistent lot. Arianne then asked, well, what did the young children in K through 3rd grade do to be suspended in the first place? So we looked at that. And guess what we found? We found that 74% of the kindergarten through 3rd grade students were suspended for the category called other behavior. Do you know what other behavior is? Right. Other is another word, a euphemism for minor. That's behavior that's so minor we don't even have a category or a name for it. 74%. And think about it, ladies and gentlemen. Let us pose this question. Based on the research and the research that Arianne has shared with you and what we have presented so far today, does it make you wonder how many of those young students may have had a language difficulty and their behavior became their language? We all, regardless of age, seek to be heard. And maybe the behavior was an expression of their need to be heard. As we saw with the data, it's possible that we are mischaracterizing language difficulties as inattention, defiance, cognitive problems, anger, or a lack of willingness to engage. And let me say here and now that we're not about making excuses for behavior. No, this is not about making excuses for behavior. This is about being purpose-driven to understanding behavior, to finding solutions that may require taking a closer look at behavior and considering what we haven't considered before. And ladies and gentlemen, what's wrong with taking a closer look? Is it possible that language is that missing link, the basic problem? Are we so quick to judge and so quick to react and so quick to characterize behavior that we can't take the time to consider other possibilities and causes for behavior? And consider this, and this is one of the most important points, I think, of the presentation. If it can help if we reconceptualize behavior as a form of language. If we take the opportunity to understand what the behavior may be telling us and take into account the situation, the behavior of others, and even our own behavior and our own reactions, we might be able to shed light on the basic problem. And remember what Arianne said, there's a crack in everything, that's how the light gets in. Perhaps language can go from a missing link to a beacon, a guiding light, taking us to where we need to go and seeing what we need to see. So here's another very important question for us. How is language linked to mental health?
So just before I transition to the next slide, I just wanted to say how inspired I am by the audience, the comments in the chat. I don't have time to talk about all of the amazing thoughts here, but one I wanted to point out is, what if it isn't about the kids at all? Right? In this case, rather about teachers' expectations changing, and I might even extend that to the system. And one of the points being using something so prevalent like language. There are other prevalent things, but this one as a guiding light to change the way we think is such an incredible opportunity, and to change the way we act. And I think one of the things we've been sort of saying in different ways all along is that this flipping of the script, rather than focusing on what's wrong with the child, what does the child need or what they did, it's really how might we create the conditions that must be in place so that each and every child can succeed. And so what happens around us and what happens in the system helps inform our ability and the system's ability and everybody's role in the system to create those conditions. I'm in awe of this audience, and very excited, and would love to have all of you also be in Georgia at the same time for our children. So with that, I'll just go right over to another area that language links to, mental health. Although often not apparent, language development is a significant contributing factor to the prevention of emotional and mental health problems throughout childhood and adolescence. Over the last several years, there's been more and more research on this topic. Direction of effect is something that's really come out of the research. Studies of children ages 2 to 13 demonstrate that language difficulties predict later behavioral problems more strongly than behavioral problems predict later language difficulties. It points to noticing and enhancing language development as a useful tool to help prevent and mitigate behavioral problems. And a point on that, there was a note in the chat related to an issue with a child who is nonverbal. And that's an opportunity to consider how might we provide the supporting modalities to be able to nurture engagement with the child. So sometimes it's not going to be something traditional, but thinking about those supports and those modalities that we can think about and incorporate into the day-to-day actions of the system. So let's take a look at that a little more deeply. Language has a demonstrated protective effect on the mental health of children and teens, as the ability to share and cope with emotions relies on inner language. So inner language, it's a really important thing to consider, having inner language, right? So if you think about it, if you ever make a to-do list when you wake up in the morning, even just in your head, even if you don't jot things down, you might feel like you've got so much on your plate, you're not even sure where to start. This is just a really simple example. But as you're going through that to-do list and you're really organizing your day, you're using inner language all the time. And it may not even be something that you're thinking about. And I don't know if you could imagine going through the day without having inner language, the way in which you're seeing the world, the way in which you're dealing with your day. The failure to develop a capacity for effective communication often leads to inattention, hyperactivity, self-regulation problems, and jeopardizes emotional and mental health. Again, that's sort of a lever for improvement, a lever for change. Example, findings from a study of 265,000 5-year-old children revealed that children with effective use of language and communication were 19 times more likely to have high mental health competence than children without effective use of language and communication. Again, pointing to an opportunity that it's a powerful indicator. Noticing language difficulties is complicated by the fact that they're often quickly misinterpreted, characterized, and labeled. Remember attribution, right? And there's a tendency to pathologize behavior in general, whether or not somebody is clinically trained to, kind of diagnose, but we may jump straight to pathologizing before describing, as was mentioned earlier. So here's an example, labels or descriptions. ADHD, these are common acronyms, right? ADHD, ODD, conduct disorder. They share similar characteristics with language difficulties. And the language difficulty is really rarely mentioned, but here are those similar characteristics: difficulty listening when spoken to, problems following instructions, talking excessively, blurting out answers, interrupting, not waiting for turns in conversation. And there are often times when quickly jumping to label or pathologize this, what you're describing here sometimes can take us down a different path than would be most helpful. Do you ever say this or heard somebody say, right, nothing works? I know something's wrong. I just can't put my finger on it. Not always, but in this case, we're looking at something kind of prevalent. Just consider, is it language? And I talked about inner language before, and I like to stress it because it's just such an important part of our well-being. Language provides one's inner dialogue, and that's required to effectively reason, comprehend, self-regulate, cope with the demands of everyday life. Right? So when you actually think about what the ability to comprehend, self-regulate, and cope with the demands of everyday life, that's actually kind of a way that is helping to define what we mean by mental health. So when you look at the definition of mental health from the CDC, for example, you'll see this reflected, the ability to self-regulate, cope with the demands of everyday life. Children and teens, the research shows, with a strong inner dialogue are more likely to self-regulate, cope with problems, and are better protected actually against the development of depression. That's from Starr et al. In 2020, a very powerful study. In contrast, children and teens with language difficulties struggle to develop an inner dialogue and are less likely to reason, understand others, self-regulate, and cope with problems. So what does this mean?
Well, operating at the surface level, in other words, at the remedy level, when instead the situation really requires a deeper understanding of a child's emotional state, can result in a child or teenager being judged as selfish or uncaring. So instead consider the possibility of language difficulties and how they can impact our responses and interactions. A basic problem, not just a presenting problem. And I will, since I had a chance to look at some of the chats, I have to agree with Arianne. The chats are amazing. In fact, if we put all the chats together, we could probably create a very good presentation. A lot of insightful comments in the chat, and we really appreciate that. And in fact, I agree with Arianne. I'm very impressed with that. And let's give an example of what we're talking about on another level, and that is, let's look at talk-based therapy for children and teens, which is often based on the assumption that the child's language represents their thoughts and feelings, that the child or teenager has the language necessary to fully express themselves. Well, for children and teens with language difficulties, this expectation of language competency can really create a situation that can be confusing for them and stressful for them and frustrating to them, because they don't have the language to express themselves or say what's troubling them, or even explain how confusing things are to them, or understand what's even being said to them. And this is one of the many reasons why language is so important, because understanding language development in children and teens will not only influence the diagnostic process, it will also help determine the most appropriate and frankly thoughtful response. And consider this example from a case study of what can be done when we consider language. A 10-year-old boy was referred with a diagnosis of psychosis. Now look at that diagnosis, psychosis, based on his very peculiar responses during testing. And then during therapy sessions, he was extremely active and talkative. Questions and problem-solving approaches often led to inappropriate and, again, peculiar verbal responses. However, a brief language screening indicated the likelihood of receptive language difficulties. So when the therapist enhanced opportunities for engagement in different ways in therapy by adding visual cues like pictures and drawings, the child's activity level decreased, leveled off, and he was able to work with the therapist. The child was able to draw pictures of the problem situation, which the primary problem was he was being teased and harassed by his peer group, and then draw alternative ways of dealing with the frustration and anger. In another case study, a 5-year-old student had terrible temper tantrums. I'm talking about on the floor, screaming and yelling type of temper tantrums every time the teacher instructed the students to move from one activity to another. The teacher had training in language awareness in the 3 areas: receptive, expressive, and pragmatic. And because of that training, noticed that the student did not appear to understand the instructions. The teacher thought the student did not understand the concept of transition and the instructions related to transition. Therefore, she gave the student a stuffed animal as a link to the concept of transition. And guess what happened? Well, the temper tantrum ceased. And this stopped what could have been a trajectory towards suspensions. And because of the teacher's insight about language, it kept the child in class and successful. Instead of, the trajectory. Otherwise, the parent would be told that if the child doesn't improve the behavior, we may have to remove the child, and you know what happens from that point. So here's another important question is, how is language linked to child welfare?
I think this was also mentioned in the chat earlier about trauma. Children and teens who experience trauma are often literally out of touch with their feelings and frequently have no language to describe their internal states. The lack of inner dialogue constrains a child's ability to reason effectively, regulate their own emotions, and cope with problems. Research shows that children and teens who have experienced abuse and neglect are 3 to 6 times more likely to have language difficulties than their non-maltreated peers. As a result, this can limit their use of language to communicating basic needs rather than for social or emotional reasons, such as thoughts and feelings. Again, looking at these data and these elements from the research as indicators of strengthening the overall system and not thinking about what we traditionally would do in responding to someone's needs or doing the same thing over and over with every child. This was pretty powerful. Again, fairly recent research comparing the pragmatic language, remember that social communication of 42-month-old neglected children to their same age peers, found that 44% of neglected children had pragmatic language difficulties compared to only 4% of non-neglected children, 11 times. As we go up into school age, a review of studies examining maltreated school age children and teens found that 86% had significant language difficulties. Children and teens in foster care, this is interesting. This is from Snow, Dr. Pamela Snow. We thought this was interesting, and it was in some cases seen as controversial, but it's not inflammatory. Children and teens in foster care who are in talk-based behavior therapy and case planning are effectively in a second language environment if language and communication development has not been considered. And we think about that in the way we interact with children, their families, their bio families, and what we can do. Children and teens in foster care who have language difficulties are more likely to experience problems with resilience and well-being, low overall education attainment, challenging behaviors, problems with success in behavioral and mental health interventions. And children and teens in foster care with language difficulties have longer stays in care than their peers. Here's an example from the foster care system. This is child A's story. Prior to her present placement, a 15-year-old girl had 20 previous placement breakdowns and a history of aggressive verbal and physical behavior. She had previously been identified as having no obvious difficulties with her ability to communicate. And I underlined this next part, but that she would communicate emotion by her behavior. So that's, again, an important thing to note. Following staff concern about her language and communication, a language screening was completed and indicated a likelihood of difficulties, especially with expressive and pragmatic language. The results were used to inform her foster parents, case managers, teachers, therapists, and the court staff about opportunities to enhance their practice and environments to foster child A's engagement at home, in school, during therapy, and in the courtroom. As a result of enhancing opportunities to foster investment, independence, and initiation in all settings, her communication, social engagement, and behavior improved significantly. Her case manager said, "What I've experienced is her improved confidence in expressing herself, listening, and understanding. This has been an invaluable part of the progress she had made in placement and has allowed her greater opportunities to make meaningful relationships with adults and peers alike." This reminds me of a comment in the chat about again, what are we doing to create, how do we create those supports? We provide multiple opportunities to have access to effective communication, right? I will say this is an example from England, where it incorporating and thinking about this element as an indicator is stronger than it is, at least I know, in Georgia. And you notice here that the response was a response to strengthen the system's opportunity to be able to create the conditions necessary so that the child is able to do better. So how is language linked with juvenile justice?
And before I talk about this slide, I want to mention, respond to several comments that we've seen in the chat about trauma. And as Arianne talked about children in foster care, it's not uncommon for children in foster care and other children for that matter to have adequate receptive language skills, but inadequate expressive language skills. And just think about that just for a moment. If you're able to understand what was going on around you, but you could not express your reaction to what's going on around you, could not talk about it effectively, how frustrated would you be? And how often would that frustration result in impacting your behavior? Just contemplate that. And I think that's powerful because so many people in the chat are talking about trauma. On this slide, we wanted to point out that internationally known researchers, and Arianne mentioned Dr. Snow, but also Dr. Hopkins, they have found that children and teens involved with juvenile justice are, look at this, 5 times more likely than non-offending peers to have language difficulties. 5 times more likely. However, those children and teens typically are not given any type of language screening. And that's why we're working with the departments of juvenile justice and also juvenile court judges and court caseworkers and others to encourage them to consider the importance of language. We have some pilot projects that Arianne's working closely with that have confirmed that many juveniles going into the juvenile justice system in Georgia have language problems. And let's give another practical example of what that might mean, that being language problems. As we know, many schools and even courts are implementing restorative practice. And the research shows, and in some situations, restorative practice is very effective. And typically a school principal or juvenile court judge wants to know, of course, how the child or teen responded to the restorative practice session. Did they engage? Did they seem to be interested? Did they show any remorse for what they did? And look what the report may sound or look like if the juvenile or the child has expressive or receptive language difficulties. You may hear comments like this in the report. The only thing we heard from the teenager was, yep, nope, don't know, maybe he wasn't engaged, he just didn't seem to care. Now, keep in mind with the receptive language difficulties, this student may appear to understand what's being said, but really doesn't. He may even nod in agreement, but he could be missing important nuances during the session and lacks the language necessary to understand and fully engage in the restorative practice session. It's interesting is we were doing this research, we found another very interesting and relevant discovery about language. And please understand, this presentation, we change it all the time. Callie's he's seen the presentation and he's probably seeing things that are different in the presentation because as the research continues, we try to incorporate what we're learning. And this is one of the things that we learned, that the expression of remorse is very complex and requires the effective use of language and social communications. And for example, the words must be appropriate, of course, but the delivery, the tone of voice, and the facial expressions must also match. And how many times have we heard this about a child or a teenager? He showed no remorse for what he did. And that attribution could lead to a response or consequence that only makes the situation worse because the behavior has possibly been mischaracterized. And let me tell you a quick story since we have some time. We did this presentation to juvenile court judges, and a judge came up to us afterwards and said, Arianne, Gary, I want to tell you a story. I was in court. A 15-year-old was brought to me for breaking and entering. I wasn't too worried about what happened. 15 years of age, no problem with rehabilitation. I didn't have a whole lot to worry about. Was told that the student was not a discipline problem. But during the court hearing, I could not engage with the student at all. The 15-year-old would not respond to any question other than shaking or nodding his head. I couldn't engage with this 15-year-old at all. I couldn't get him to say anything. And the judge said, Arianne and Gary, I admit I became a little frustrated. And I said to the young man, well, are you sorry? And the 15-year-old just went ballistic. He yelled and screamed, knocked everything off the table, jumped up out of his chair, pushed the chair back so hard it fell down. The security came over and grabbed him and started to take him out, and the judge got very angry. Then as the young man was leaving the court, the judge said, wait a minute, stop. Everybody stop. Everybody settle down. Bring him back to the table. Because he knew that something that he had said set this child off, and he just was very puzzled about it. And to make a long story short, what he found out was that this young man at the age of 3 lost his father. And between the age of 3 and the age of 15, his stepfather called him sorry every day. Every day he heard from his stepfather many times during the day, you're sorry, you're worthless, you'll never amount to anything, you're sorry. So when I said, are you sorry? His interpretation of that one word made all the difference in the world. And my reaction, the judge said, to that one word could have changed the trajectory for that child for the rest of his life. Now, today we have encouraged purpose-driven efforts to find solutions in creating a new system. And we don't want to leave you with just all the problems and all the issues and all the possibilities. So let's talk about what can be done.
So we are just providing a handful of examples of opportunities for thinking and responding and actions that are informed by the research. One thing I want to point out is this next quote that we hope reflects so much of what we've been talking about here. When a flower doesn't bloom, you fix the environment in which it grows. Right? It's not what's wrong with this flower. How might we create the conditions necessary? Again, so many of the comments in the chat point to things we need to consider about this way. So in what way are we going to create the conditions? In what way are we going to respond? So one basic thing that we suggest is let's include language as a well-being indicator. Just overall. We already do with things like vision and hearing and oral health and other well-being indicators, right? Just something that is part of everyday life and may not even be incorporated. One thing that we often also will typically share in this presentation is where this is not something that's focusing in on if a child is the process for an IEP or if there's a cognitive problem, because the research actually doesn't show that link directly to a cognitive issue. It really isn't, and that can also be very misleading. So having a language issue sometimes can be misinterpreted again as a cognitive problem, and that can take us down a wrong path. So just thinking about it as an flipping it and not thinking about let's look for problems, let's understand development. Understanding development will help everybody. So we can expand use of strategies and routine well child visits that provide families with guidance about noticing and opportunities to enhance language development. We and our partners developed a tool that we'll be showing in just a second that can support that, but just overall understanding that what's working well and how can we do more of that. We can provide training to increase awareness and understanding of the relationship between language development and mental health. So again, we talked about earlier today that In Georgia, we have had a wonderful omnibus bill passed this session about improving mental health. And there's so many different things that actually directly impact mental health that sometimes are not included on the table, right? We may think about just some specific things like a service or something like that, and may not think about, wow, this is a powerful indicator that the more we can create those conditions so that all children and teens have access to communication and are able to engage with others, that engagement actually is helps support mental health. So in an attempt to employ language as a well-being indicator, individuals, practitioners, and policies can integrate the following practices into everyday settings. So these are things that are can be applied in multiple ways. And I'm just going to share it in this often typically seen image of a pyramid. And one is we have created a tool called language development by age band. I'm going to show that in just a second, but we can make sure everybody notices indicators of language development in children and teens. So what we are saying here specifically is we're not saying indicators of problems. We want to be sure to take an asset-based approach. It's useful enough because that way we will be able to help consider all children. And we're really talking about development and indicators of development and not even thinking about skills. We're really thinking about indicators of development. And I'm going to show you that. It's an important distinction. Sometimes when we think about skills, we're thinking about teaching the individual child. And again, sometimes keeps us away from, again, what is our practice in creating that environment for all children to be able to engage and succeed. It's a little bit of a small distinction, but it's an important one. We can monitor engagement as a means to gauge language development. Callie knows one of our heroes, Emily Rubin, who is the co-author of something called Social Emotional Engagement, Knowledge and Skills. And there's a social engagement ladder. We really think about looking at engagement. In fact, we did a pilot and the results were so powerful. We were able to actually use a simple engagement ladder from a 0 to a 4, from a almost no level of engagement to a very high level of engagement as a proxy for language difficulties to be able to incorporate into decision-making at the universal level. Very powerful way of addressing this. What we did, and actually we did this in the pilot, is that if engagement levels of specific children or teens were low on multiple occasions, we then used a screening tool to discern potential difficulties. And so there's some traditional valid and reliable tools, the PLS-5, CCC2, the SELF. But the point was there too, is we are not advocating universal screening. We're actually not fans of universal screening. It's really talking about monitoring engagement. And then we were able to have a triage system so it also doesn't overtax the system. This actually made it quite easy on the system where we were piloting this, because it did sound like we were going to have to do that, but that wasn't the case. Now, the truth was, in the system where we piloted, we ended up with 46% of the children that we ended up doing the screening on, but I wasn't surprised knowing some of the overall population data. But here's the part that this was able to inform. Now, before I tell you the next part, how many of you were expecting that I was going to go to the top of the pyramid as the next step? Come on, be honest, right? I wish I could be in person, because oftentimes I see the eyes go up to the top, because that's the traditional way of looking at these types of pyramids, especially if you're in an education setting. But what we did in our pilot and what we were proposing and what we propose is that we can use those data. There's so much of those data that we had one child, we had 2 children and 116 who didn't. So we were fewer children who were 2 or more standard deviations below the norm. But we had a very high number that were sort of between the 1 and the 2. Now, what seems to typically happen, again, this isn't my world, I come from the world of epidemiology and actually perinatal and maternal and child health, but is that we might not consider those data. It's a lot of data. If you're falling between a 1 and a 2, what that means is that's data. Those results can be used to enhance opportunities for frequent positive language-rich social interaction and continue to monitor that engagement. What it allowed us to do was to think about, what are we doing? What do we need to do in the environment differently? How do we need to create the conditions necessary so that we're able to, as somebody said in the chat, that access to language, that access to communication, how might we structure differently? How might we have the setting differently? How might we incorporate things? And what it allowed us to do for the 2 children that needed additional supports, we were able to do, make sure that that individual therapy was provided. It was very interesting because the immediate response from some people when we started doing this presentation was, we don't have enough speech and language pathologists. We were like, but it's not about speech and language pathologists, because when you're talking about it, we're not honing in on speech here. We're really focusing on this issue. And in so many of the situations, yes, we want that speech and language pathologist. We don't want them just relegated to work individually one-on-one with children. They can actually provide their goldmine of knowledge to support the whole, to support the teachers. When we did the pilot in the system we were in, the speech and language pathologists were thrilled because they were part of that whole audience of all the teachers and being able to engage in that dramatic increase in the awareness and understanding of what we mean by language, what the opportunities are, and the ways in which everybody has a role, in which the way they interact with children, the way they structure the day, the way they respond. So that was very exciting part. We actually have, from the social emotional engagement knowledge and skills, is a quick reference tool that's actually been created. We use that to structure peer mentorship approaches to look at what's working well and how can we do more of that in terms of enhancing those opportunities at the universal level. Oh, I forgot to say too, we created 4 brief videos. They're 5 minutes each, one for infant toddler settings, one for early childhood settings, one for elementary settings, and one for teenagers and secondary school settings. And they are videos on how to use the social engagement ladder. So I can send those to Callie. So those will be available. They're online. You can download them and share those.
And Arianne, I put them in the chat.
Oh, great. Thank you. So those videos are there. And with this approach, it's not limited to school settings, although it could be an approach used for evaluations and reevaluations for IEPs. Can also be done through children and teens at risk of involvement with or involved with foster care or juvenile justice. And that can inform proactive work and actions with educators, healthcare providers, and others. This is the language development by age band tool that I mentioned. We actually had to develop this because what we were unable to find, and now some of you may know of one, we were unable to find something that indicated simply indicators of language development by age band in 2 ways. One is this goes from birth to 18, everything that we looked at stopped at age 5. And the other is that this incorporates expressive, receptive, and pragmatic. And there wasn't something that really honed in on all 3 elements. And this, of course, is freely accessible as well. But it's also something that it doesn't have to be filled out by child, but it can also just be as an educational tool to consider. For example, if I'm working with a child who's in the 12 to 18-year-old age range, and I'm expecting them to use these types of abilities, right? These have these indicators, but there really might be more at a 6 to 11-year-old, then we can think about what are ways which we're gonna structure our environment or create that process of access, which I saw in the chat as well. We can train mental health providers to complete a brief language screening as part of their initial assessment for all children and teens referred to them. That can be used to inform both the diagnostic process and the interventions considered. So in what way might I interact, given that yes, I have found that there is a particular diagnosis. In what way is the response most appropriate? And also we can conduct a review of existing practices and policies across all systems to identify and proactively include opportunities to enhance engagement as the gauge of language development. So think about that. We talk about enhancing engagement as a means to gauge language development. And this recommendation is intended to address the gap. We sometimes might actually use the word chasm between our knowledge of the impact of language and our universal practice and policies. Because is this the system we want to continue? Or is it time to create a new system that is solution-based? Solutions, not remedies. Thank you.
Well, thank y'all very much. It is just a breath of fresh air and a breath of breath air to have y'all here and to hear this presentation again. And thank you so much for all of the chat and participation. In so many ways, it's just been a wonderful gathering. Pam, I know you've been monitoring the chat. I'm gonna bring you up to the screen, and if you want to just share what you have seen and any questions that have come up or thoughts.
Yeah, sure. So first of all, Dr. McGiboney, Arianne, thank you so much, both of you, not only for an amazing presentation, but also, I mean, you guys are presenting and actively monitoring the chat too. So kudos for the multitasking, although I don't like to always have that expectation. We did have many comments, and you've made reference to some. I'm going to address some of the questions, however, that I noted in the chat. One is really more of a statement. So folks, if you've put a comment in the chat that I overlook, feel free to either raise your hand or retype it and let us know that it is a question you'd like for us to address. But Kristen writes, it's so difficult to figure out the why and what behind our daughter's behavior. She is nonverbal and diagnosed with Down syndrome and autism. Would you all like to take a moment and speak to Kristen's comment?
Well, I'll go first, Gary, please chime in. So this is a time where engaging with speech and language pathology is very important. And that ability to communicate, I wonder if you've already engaged with, but also having that the opportunity to understand how to create those conditions and access to language to be able to engage. In fact, the other thing that also connects, and it sometimes is typically thought about, but not always. So again, I'm always learning. But a pediatric occupational therapist is also a really great partner and friend in understanding just sort of the reactions to things, right? So sometimes it can be, actually with my own son when he was young, we had issues around sensory integration and really thinking about that. But that combination of a pediatric OT and speech and language pathologists can be really great friends. I'm not just only talking about in terms of the word therapy. I really think about as friends and allies in helping to understand others. And one of the things that in Georgia, we have our foster care system, many children are in our managed care foster care plan in Georgia. And I serve on the steering committee for that. And we actually have a foster parent on there who we're so lucky. And they had a foster child that they had recently out, and he actually they recently adopted him, which is exciting. But he was nonverbal. The child was 4 and nonverbal as well. And so really thinking about things, the preliminary diagnosis he mentioned in this first meeting we had was of autism. And there was a direct link over to ABA. When I stressed, you may want to consider seeing if you can engage a speech and language pathologist and pediatric OT. He actually said, I'd never thought about that. Nobody's ever mentioned that to me before. And he'd been a foster parent for 20 years. So that was interesting. And it may just, again, be a gap in the area or something like that. But what seemed to come out from that over the last 3 or 4 years now they're adopting him, is that he found that to be helpful. I'm not sure if that's answered your question. You may have already engaged those friends, but those are areas where thinking about engagement and like if you think about when is a time when your child has been engaging, right? Has been, engaging, has appeared to enjoy something and appeared to be interacting. What were you doing at that time, right? And what were the things that were happening? In what way were things structured at that time? And then what that does is it allows you to think about, how can I do more of that? And that's actually kind of the secret to the sauce of what, and somebody asked who the question was about SEEKs, is Emily Rubin. You'll see that in those videos. And actually watch those videos, I think that'll help you, is really noticing that, because we have a tendency to look at what went wrong and what's not working. And appreciative inquiry is a really major part of what Emily talks about. So in what times, in what ways, what was happening, and how can I do more of that? I just kept babbling a little bit, so keep going. Sorry.
And the only thing I'll add to that is we really need to sharpen our observation skills, because what may be working may be for 30 seconds. And we don't pay any attention to that because it's 30 seconds. But that could be so important. My son had neurological issues when he was born, and as an infant, as a young child, he didn't speak. He had language issues. And what we noticed was, and what we paid very close attention to, even if it was 30 seconds, is what did he do? What did he like to do that was of some type of expression? And to make a long story short, he became very accomplished at artwork, at oil paints. And very quickly, I kind of experienced this language issue because I had a traumatic brain injury. I could not speak for a long time. And so I kind of experienced that. And as Arianne mentioned, to me, one of the most important therapies was the combination of the speech therapist and the occupational therapist. The occupational therapist was key to my recovery. And so again, I just want to emphasize to that parent and to all the ones who are working with children, as Arianne said, and Emily has said repeatedly, look for what works and not focus so much on what is not working, because we are missing some opportunities to see what really works. And like that, just think of the teacher with the teddy bear, something so simple that she observed, and how much that impacted that child's life.
Great responses to this parent. I want to make sure, Sarah Potter, that you heard and see in the chat an answer to your question, who is the author of Social Emotional Engagement. I think Arianne has addressed that. There you go. Thank you. And then our own Philip Woodward added a question in the chat. What can schools do to help students with intellectual and other developmental disabilities be their best and foster atmospheres where they will succeed?
Well, I'll start with that one because I have a strong belief in the importance of the adults in the school. That's where it starts. It starts with the climate of the school. If the school does not have a positive climate, there's not going to be engagement. There's not going to be engagement between the teachers and the students, between students and students, and between teachers and teachers. Students will not feel connected at the school. They will not feel engaged at the school. So a key basic foundational requirement to the answer to this question is to develop a positive school climate. You have to. There's just no exception to that. Climate is ubiquitous. And if you look at, look at workplace climate. A study was done at Harvard University that was published in 2015 in a major study. And they looked at what's the difference between successful and unsuccessful businesses. What is the secret sauce, as Arianne says, for sustainability and success? And what they found overwhelmingly was the workplace climate. That's the same in schools. You have to have a positive school climate. That's foundational. That's where it starts. And from that, what you'll see evolve from that is that in that school, you will develop and see it develop organically a little system of care. You will see more interaction between teachers and teachers, more interactions between teachers and students. You will see people caring about each other. If a student is out of school for a day or two and they come back, somebody asks them, "Are you okay? What do you need?" If you see it in that type of school, if a student is withdrawn and is not engaging, in a lot of schools, we just say, leave that student alone. It's not causing a problem. But in a caring school, somebody will reach out to that child and find out why is that child withdrawing? Why is that child so quiet? Why is that child not communicating? And I have found out, because I was a school psychologist, in those schools that are positive, if you have a child that has any type of developmental disability, they feel welcome. They feel part of the school. The school will find ways for them to reach out, to communicate, to engage, feel connected. That's part of the positive school climate. So it starts there. And from there, what will happen, and I saw it myself in schools, teachers and administrators will find staff members that fit the climate of that school, engaging, connected philosophy about the importance of that environment, and also reaching out and touching and interacting with every student every day. So I could talk a long time about that, but I'm very passionate about that. And as Callie said, in Georgia, we were able to increase the number of schools implementing positive behavior interventions and supports to 1,400 schools. And you can see, and we have the data to show how student outcomes improve when you improve the climate of the school. And you see fewer suspensions, but also you see fewer students referred to special education because so many of their needs are being met at Tier 1 in the classroom.
Yeah, and I'll just add to that a little bit and of course, Dr. McGiboney literally wrote the book on school climate, so that's something that Callie can share with you later. Is oftentimes we'll call our presentation sort of the part 1, and then Emily Rubin will deliver the part 2. So if there's an opportunity to have Emily present later, and an approach to strengthening and supporting and having a positive school climate, social emotional engagement, knowledge and skills is at the Tier 1 level, to really go deeply on engagement and be able to create those conditions, really think about it's really about the social and emotional engagement, the knowledge and skills of the teachers and adults and their ability to interact approaches through everyday routine interaction. So it's not through separate things. It's not about teaching social skills. It's not about that. It's really about in what ways are you creating those conditions through routine everyday work. Emily's an incredibly engaging speaker. You'll see that in those brief videos that we've included. And those actually provide an intro to applying the SEEKS approach. And then all of the materials, I put her website in the chat, are freely accessible. There are actually whole countries that apply this approach. I know that in cities in the world, Hong Kong, Edinburgh, actually Scotland, all of Scotland, and other countries. So it's kind of a worldwide star and a very humble, brilliant individual. So that's another element, and the tools are freely accessible, and that's really grown across the state. We are actually going to be releasing what we call the Language is a Missing Link and Missed Opportunity Toolkit in mid-June, and that'll be on. We'll have a web page for it. It's actually it'll be part of the Get Georgia Reading campaign website. Part of many things that I work on includes helping to coordinate our state's campaign for grade level reading, which is called the Get Georgia Reading campaign. But we'll have that, including all those materials we referred to.
Wonderful. Great. Thank you. There's a question that's possibly in my realm. Dreama McCoy asks, when will the video be available? Dreama, we're so excited that you want to both rewatch and potentially share. If you will give us maybe a week's time, and tomorrow is a holiday for us, but let us review and make sure that there are, that it's pretty seamless, then we'll be able to share that out. Also, Callie and others have been helping us. We have a brief 3-minute survey, not at all a critique of Dr. McGiboney and Arianne, but just asking you for feedback and giving you a chance to let us know how this might help you better advocate for yourself or for a loved one in this space. And we want to be responsible stewards of the financing that comes our way, and this will be used to generate our annual federal report. So if you could find in the chat the link to that brief survey monkey, we would be grateful for that. Finally, I've seen another chat from Katrina, who asks, how much do genetics play a role?
We haven't delved deep into that specifically. I mean, it's
What we have found is in the research, and again, a lot of the research is in the UK. What we have found so far is that if you have a child in school that has expressive or receptive language problems and you have a parent conference, you will notice that the parents are likely to also have receptive and expressive language problems. It seems to be a learned behavior, or the lack of a learned behavior. In fact, we've heard from Judge Key, who is in Troup County, Georgia, and who has really embraced all of this. And he's seen every time the school implements PBIS to improve school climate, he sees a reduction in the referrals to juvenile court. But also he's seen that when he meets with parents, because he has a family court, he has seen that dynamic of the lack of expressive or expressive language skills go back even to the grandparents. So it's a lot of it is exposure, the lack of opportunity, the lack of being in a language rich environment. And you think about that, a child who's not been in a language rich environment, and yet we diagnose them with some diagnosis. In fact, they just have not even been in a language rich environment to even develop those skills. So if we put them, and we've seen it and we've heard about it time and time again, you put them in a language rich environment, giving them those opportunities to be exposed to a lot of different language, expressive and receptive and pragmatic situations, that they do then start acquiring those skills.
Yeah, and really looking at it as in what ways are we considering our own practices? Because remember, again, it's the indicators, and then through our practices that development occurs. And so what we see is that actually I have a wonderful video from Emily Rubin where she talks about those differences between whether it's all children, whether there's a genetic vulnerability, autism was mentioned today, or environmental issues, that engagement as the key across the board, moving the needle on engagement is like the one thing that when you're seeing that move. So what are the ways in which we provide the supports, the modalities, the things that we can do through the way that we engage that strengthen a child's opportunity to engage. That's where that development comes from. And of course, I mean, some people talk about the development of these phones, right? That you see very young children even with these. And it's, again, I'm not saying ban screen time. There are certainly, the AAP has recommendations, all of that, but that lack of engagement. Some of you may have seen that wonderful couple of, well, there was a wonderful YouTube of a father on a couch with his child. They were watching the TV together, but he was interacting with his little boy who was maybe 18 months of age. And it's pretty famous now. And then there was a Denny's commercial with them. It's adorable. If I can remember it, I'll put it in the chat. But you see that opportunity through everyday routine moments. So even if you're sitting and watching a Sesame Street or something with your child, but that interaction with the child is really critical. So a lot of times you're going to see children interacting with a tablet or a phone, and mom and dad are busy. I mean, I get it. It's a lot of those things really to consider and think about, that are, can be hindrances as well.
Well, I just want to say thank you. I think we had one other question that Jenny asked about evaluations. And Jenny, I don't know if you wanted to expound on that. You can unmute. And then I think we're going to let you get all the way back to Georgia. But we are so grateful for today. Go ahead, Jenny.
We are very grateful. This has been incredibly helpful information, and all of the resources are incredibly helpful too. And we really appreciate you allowing us to record it and share it, because there's so many people that, even just the folks on my team have been sending me messages like, we need to share this with these different people. So we're, again, very thankful. And I think that my question was actually answered in one of the slides. You made some suggestions about different evaluations that would be helpful. And they look like the ones that we're pretty familiar with from IEP evaluations. So that's really good.
Terrific. Well, Garry and Arianne, we are so grateful, and we're grateful for everyone who has joined us for this presentation, for all of the chat, for all the different ways in which we've shared this presentation through language and ASL and captioning and Spanish. I can't wait to see y'all again. I'll get the evaluations to you. I can tell you that there's a lot of requests for you to do this again and do this in different ways. I'm pretty sure my counterpart from Tennessee, who's an executive director of the council there, is very interested in engaging with y'all. So thank you very, very much. And please continue to do this great work, and please plan to move to North Carolina soon so you can help us here. But it is great to see you, and thank you so much.
Thank you, Callie. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
All right, thank you.
Take care. Bye-bye.